Rhetorical Quest.
Hi, so today we're going to talk a little bit about identity and impression management and even get a little bit into lying if everything goes according to plan. So back in 1989, a communication researcher by the name of Walter S. Minot identified two kind of distinct selves, parts of the self, your identity. And he called one of those identities your personality, and the other one your persona. And I think that's a really useful distinction as we're talking about this idea. So there's two kind of parts to this, right? Even your personality. Your personality is in part made by nature. Some of it's your genetic makeup, and your genetic makeup responding to certain stimuli in your environment. And that is how your genetic makeup would respond to the stimuli. And that is really probably not something we're going to study at all in communication. What we are interested in studying in communication is the other part, the nurture part, right? So this is like reflected appraisal. Like somebody calls you something and then you say, oh, is that who I am? That might be who I am. Or social comparison. This person is something. Am I like them? Maybe I'm like them. And so with that, we develop this personality, right? And Adler, Proctor, and Manning point out that some of this self-concept also includes things that just aren't true anymore. I talked to somebody who's like, I'm a real reader. And I was like, oh, really? What was the last book you read? And they start to think about, they haven't read any book in 3 years. Well, they still see them as a reader, but they're just wrong. Or, sometimes obsolete information. This is who I am. Well, it's who you were. I mean, that's obsolete information. Perfectionism, distorted feedback. I don't see myself as a good boy because I am very seldom good. Why do I say I'm very seldom good? Because good is as a perfection, right? And social expectations. I act as a professor. I act as a father because I am expected to play those roles. There was this German philosopher who dealt with these ideas. He was a German philosopher before, during, and after World War II with all of the problematic stuff that goes with being a German philosopher in that time. So you do kind of have to be aware of that. But he had some really brilliant ideas in there too. He had this idea of how we go about this nurture stuff. This part of us of discovering who we are. And he calls this thrownness, or his translators call this thrownness, just being thrown out into the universe. And you don't really know who you are. So how do you find out who you are? Well, by interaction with other sentient beings. And in that interaction, you start to develop a sense of being, an ontological sense, we call it sometimes. You start to notice this sense of who I am, where I am, and you figure that stuff out. But this is just you being thrown out there, and it's hard. And you're constantly working on it. As long as you're a sentient being thrown out into this universe where you don't understand everything, you're constantly dealing with appraisals and ideas and is this who I am? Is that who I am? This person called me old man. Am I an old man? Is that what I am right now? I don't know. I heard that from somebody. I gotta think of that because another sentient being perceived me that way, and that might be real, and it might be right. And so it's really hard to know what you really are, but you develop this personality. And in this personality, this is how you act. And when something comes up against the personality you develop, like, say you see yourself as being kind, and then you yelled at the cashier at Walmart, and then you start to say, well, that's the exception, right? Because even as new data comes in, it took so much work to build your self-concept that you just don't want to give that up. Even sometimes when it's something better, right? Like, maybe you used to cheat on your partners. Maybe that was something you used to do. But you know what? You've been with the same person for 10 years now, and you're not a cheater. But that thing in your mind, well, I am a cheater. So, I gotta, maybe you're not anymore. So even when it's good stuff, sometimes you just kind of hold on to that part of your personality because it took so much work to develop it. And so we kind of resist any kind of change to the reality we get, because when we were thrown out there, not knowing anything about what we were or who we were, that is a scary place to be. And we like to imagine that we've gone a lot further in developing ourselves than we probably really have. So that's our personality, this thing that we develop, right? And that we hold on to maybe even when we shouldn't, and that it's really hard to work on, difficult to change once we've got it. But then there's this other part of us, and that is our persona, right? So this is the aspects of ourselves that we present to the world. So here's an example, right? I have a tie on right now. Why do I have a tie on? Well, I have a tie on because I'm a professor. And right now I'm playing the role of professor. And as I play this role, part of the role is costuming, right? And so sometimes when we think about impression management, we think about lying, and they're really, and we'll get into that. Lying is a really interesting part of impression management, but it's not all lies. I really am professor of speech and communication at Western New Mexico University. I really am. That's so I'm playing a role, but that really is my job, right? This really is who I'm doing, but I still have to play the role, right? And so if I weren't wearing the tie, I probably would be okay. But there would be other parts of this interaction that would just be different. Not even the kind of language that I'm using, right? And the fact that I mention sources and mention where things come from. I don't do that in all aspects of my life. I do that in the professor aspects of my life, right? And that impression that we try and put out to the outside world, that is another aspect. And that's kind of what we call our persona, right? And we don't just have one persona. We have lots of personas. So, your personality is something you're always working on, always something but it's only one thing, right? It's always, your personality is relatively stable. Your persona, I can walk out that door and get in my car and drive to my church, and I won't be playing professor there. I'll be playing church member. Now, I really am a church member too. And that's when I say I play that, doesn't mean I'm being fake. It just means that's the role I'm playing right now. So you can see our personas aren't necessarily fake. They're not necessarily, this thing we put out there that isn't really us. Rather, it can be though, but it's really more about, we take some aspect of ourselves and present it to others as ourself. Right? And we do this for a lot of reasons. Sometimes we do it to start or to manage relationships, right? So to start the relationship that I had with my wife, she had to see me as a man, to see me as a marriageable man, to see me as useful. Then as I've gone through my marriage, right, I've had to play the role of being a husband, right? So I manage that role, that relationship, in part by playing particular roles. And I know that at certain points I've failed in that role. And when I failed in that role, it's ended up with me kind of, failing in that relationship. And so whenever I mess up like that, there's been this time where the relationship didn't really work out because some other aspect of me, besides the part that I need to manage the relationship, reared itself up, and might have been a good part, might have been a bad part, usually it's a bad part, but that kind of reared itself up, and that damages then the relationship, because the relationship is with me as a husband, right? Another reason is to gain compliance of others. Kenneth Burke wrote a lot especially if we look at his book, The Grammar of Motives. He wrote a lot about this idea that rhetoric, that is suasive communication, communication designed to move other people, isn't always so much about actual persuasion, right? That it's really more about the audience seeing you as being either them or somebody who has their best interests at heart. Now, once again, this doesn't have to be a lie. You might, when I talk to my students and I'm like, okay, I want you to do this so that you can get a good grade. I am doing it to gain compliance, and I am doing it to be persuasive, and I am trying to make them believe that I have their best interests at heart. And the reason for that is I have their best interests at heart. So it's not necessarily a lie, but you know what? I go through other parts of my day and I don't think about that student at all. I think the student is generally aware of that, right? That this is, me as professor identifying in this educational setting with somebody who is building you up. In that kind of situation, I will gain compliance, and that the student knows they don't see the whole me. Sometimes it's to save other people's face. I was thinking of a situation fairly recently where somebody got up and started talking about something. And they were right on most of the things that they said. But they didn't know as much about it as I did. And I had to fight with this part inside of me that wants to play the role of expert, because that wasn't my role in the situation. And I would have ended up making them look bad and actually making myself look like kind of a jerk too, right? If I had played the expert in that situation. So that's why I didn't. And sometimes we put out a persona as part of our process to see if this is our personality, right? We put this out and say, well, does this work for me? Right? Is this really who I am? So I start to describe myself some way, start to act in some way. I feel like when I first started playing fantasy tabletop role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, I was acting my characters, but I was acting my characters. And the reason that I had to act like that is I wasn't a fantasy tabletop role player. I had to fake it until I make it, right? And now, for sure, I am a tabletop fantasy role-playing games fanatic, right? I fake it until I make it. And sometimes you try on a self, and that self really isn't you, right? Maybe you decide to go hunting with some friends. Maybe you have a good time. You act like a hunter. You do it. And then you go home, like hunting wasn't me. I tried it a bunch of times. It just wasn't me. And that's okay, because sometimes you find out it is you. And so this is another reason that we put out a persona to people, is we're still working on our personality. And one of the things we can do is we can put this out and test it and say, is this me? And that's one of the tools that we can use. Now, every persona we put out there has varying degrees of truth, right? Like I say, I play the role of professor, but also I am a professor, but I'm not always a professor, right? There are times in my life where I am, my examples I gave, a father, a church member, a tabletop role-playing fan, right? These are different parts of who I am besides being a professor, but you don't get to see a whole lot of that as students because you get to see me as a professor, right? So it's true, but it's only part of the truth. And sometimes as a professor, I'll play up certain aspects of myself, right, that are actually kind of weak parts on me, right? Something that I'm not really all that great about, but it's part of playing the role as a professor. So I have to do it now, right? Grading. I struggle with grading. I think something that I really have trouble with. I have trouble evaluating students. I generally am so excited by every idea that I see. I want to give you all A's. I struggle with feedback, but I have to pretend that that's really something I do. And sometimes I have to pretend to enjoy grading in order to make myself grade. So it's not really true, right? But it's kind of true because I am a professor, and that's part of the role of professor, right? So these varying degrees of truth, some of our personas are, well, yeah, that's just what we are. Some of them, well, that's what we're trying on. We're trying to be this, and so we're not that yet, but we have to kind of act like it until we are. And then there are other times. And sometimes this persona that I'm putting out there, or you're putting out there, that people put out there, is so much outside of our norms, or what we're really experiencing, that we could probably say this is a lie, right? This is a fabrication, right? I tell a story about myself, and none of that stuff actually happened, but I'm trying to draw a particular picture of myself, right? Because why do we lie? The reason that we lie is the same reason that we do any other kind of impression management. The same reason we put out any persona is the reason we put out this false persona, maybe to start or to manage relationships. I think a lot of lying is done because people want to maintain a relationship the way they want it to do. And so they have to utter complete falsehoods in order to maintain that relationship, sometimes to gain compliance of others. No, Mom, I haven't had a cookie yet today, so I should be able to have one now. Oh, okay. It's not true, but you put out a persona of somebody who has not had a cookie, and then perhaps you can have a cookie. We lie a lot to save other people's face. We lie a lot to make other people feel okay about themselves. Right? The classic example is, do I look bad in this dress? Right? No, you do not look bad in that dress. Right? It's a lie, but you know what can we say? You can tell they like it. They don't really want an honest opinion sometimes, especially if you're in a relationship where you've learned that over time. So you lie so that they feel better about themselves. Oh, you didn't do a bad job. No, well, you did do a bad job. Right. So we lie so that other people can feel better about themselves and so that they can be safe. And we also lie to explore new selves. Sometimes who you really are starts out as a lie about who you are. I would say, I am, never lied and said I was a professor until I was a professor. But there were ways in which I played the intellectual, especially as an undergraduate, that I was trying that on. I wasn't, I hadn't read enough or deeply enough or long enough to be a real intellectual, but I was playing that role, and that role felt really good to me. So I kind of became that role. Right. And so in a way that started out as a lie, right? I'd maybe read 2 dialogues of Plato, but I'd act like I knew what Plato had said. Right. And and I found out that, well, you know what, actually, this is who I am and is a part of myself that I now need to develop. So those are some of the reasons we lie. And lying is really interesting. This is what I think is really interesting about lying, right? And this is the idea that when our inhibitions are down, when we're just allowed to do, we feel safe, we feel calm, we feel okay. For the most part, that's also the time when we're most likely to do bad things, right? Because our personality that we hide behind these personas is something that, I don't punch that person who is being stupid in the face, because that's not the persona I'm presenting to the world. But man, deep down inside, I want to. Way more likely to do that when you're drunk, right? When your inhibitions are down. So lying is different. And this has been known for millennia. There's a Latin phrase, right, that was common in Latin when people went around speaking that. And that's in vino veritas, right, is the Latin phrase. In wine, there is truth. Because it was discovered that people would say the true thing that they wouldn't normally say because their inhibitions go down, right? Almost every other bad thing that a person could do, you're more likely to cheat on your partner when you're drunk, right? I think that's pretty well known. You're more likely to steal a car when you're drunk. A huge number of the crimes that are committed in the world, alcohol is a contributing factor, right? Or drugs, right? And drugs are really interesting. So the drugs, the kind of notion of the truth serum that have been used by interrogators around the world. Now, no truth serum is completely perfect. People can learn to lie even when they come down, and sometimes they say that you're very susceptible to in those situations where your inhibitions are down. So if I tell you, you probably stole the car. Did you steal the car? You're like, yeah, I stole the car. But because you just told me I probably did. But you're also more likely to tell the truth when your inhibitions are down. When we talk about sodium pentothal, the most famous of all truth serums is a barbiturate, and it just makes you feel calm and happy and at peace. And so you ask somebody a question, and the first thing they do is just tell you the truth. And this is a really interesting thing about lying. People lie because they feel like they have to put this persona up that's a particular way. If a person feels safe, if a person feels comfortable, if a person feels like they can really express themselves here, that person is less likely to lie. And I think it is a fair thing. When somebody lies to you, it's their fault, right? They did it, they lied. But I think you also need to ask yourself, what have I been doing to make this person believe that they are not as safe telling me the truth? That when they make a comparison between would I be safer telling the truth or would I be safer lying, that they've come to this conclusion, even if it was a snap judgment and even if they're wrong, that lying is what they have to do. And so even though it's harder and it goes against their personality, they tell a lie. And I think that's a really interesting thing to think about when you think about your persona. Now, because all of your persona, like I said, are to varying degrees of truth. And when your inhibitions go down, the persona starts to fall away and the personality goes up. And so that's why people, when they're in very, very safe relationships, right, their whole personality can come out. And they know it can come out, and they know that they are safe in that whole personality coming out because they don't have to be inhibited and put up this persona. So I think that's a really kind of interesting part of life. And that is sort of more what I would want us to take away from this discussion of communication and the self, is an awareness that the safer we feel, or the safer your partner feels in your relationship, right? When we're talking about interpersonal communication, the other person in your relationship, in that dyad, the safer that person feels, the more they can be their authentic self. Sometimes that's bad, right? Sometimes I had a good friend who was also a communication professor who was going through a divorce. And so this good friend who was going through a divorce, he told me the story years after his divorce. But he said he was doing some consulting with a company regarding communication. And one of the people with whom he was doing the consulting came to him and said, we found out he was getting a divorce, came to him and said, well, why should we go to you to study communication? And because we know if you were a good communicator, wouldn't you not be getting a divorce? Kind of that myth that more or better communication always comes to shared understanding. Anyway, he responded. I kind of wondered, he told me the story a number of times, but I kind of wonder whether he really responded this way or just wished he had responded this way. But he told me that he responded by telling the person, well, sometimes when you really get to know someone and you really are able to be your authentic selves together, you realize that you don't like each other very much. And there's a lot of truth to that. So sometimes it's not really always good, right? I think that a lot of people who, beat up their partners. Why do they beat up their partners? Well, they beat up their partners because they felt safe enough around their partner to be their authentic self. And that's who they are. I think there's a lot to that, but I think it's mostly going to end up being a good thing, and mostly kind of a good way to gauge your relationship. If you find your partner in any kind of relationship, and I'm not just talking about romantic relationships, but any kind of relationship, if you find the other person in that relationship really needs to hide behind a persona, then they don't feel completely safe with you, right? And that's because you have made them feel unsafe. Now, maybe you've made them feel unsafe by just not being in the relationship long enough. And after they get to know you, it'll be okay. But that's something that you really need to keep in mind when we're talking about this. Now, I would love to hear what other people think about this. If you're one of my students, what I'd like you to do right now is go down and in the discussion prompt below, I would like you to talk about some of your ideas and really some of your personal experiences. Maybe a time when you tried on a self and found out that was really you, right? And that would be an interesting thing to do. Kind of the way, maybe discuss how you have different personas in different situations, what some of those personas are. Maybe your idea on lying. I'm really curious, after we've had this discussion about lying, what are your thoughts on it? Because if you just ask people outright, is it okay to lie? Everybody's going to say no. That's part of our persona. But anyway, that's what we want to put up to the world, is that person who says no. But when we start to think about it, in times when we've lied because we felt like we weren't safe telling the truth, then we start to wonder about it. And, you don't want to say it's okay to lie, but are there situations where it's okay to lie? All of that would be great fodder for the discussion below, and I would love to see that. Now, some of you are not my students. Some of you are just watching this video on YouTube. And if that's you, I'd still love to hear from you. I would love to see down in the comments below what you think about all of this discussion about the authentic self and the persona and thrownness. I'd love to hear what you'd say about it. And especially, I threw that Heidegger out there. Well, I'm not going to pretend to be a philosopher. I'm a communication professor. Maybe you know more about Heidegger than I am, and you're like, Dr. Klein, you got that wrong. I absolutely accept that. I'd love to hear from any of you just watching this for fun in the comments on YouTube. For those of you who are my students, I want it in the discussion prompt.